I saw an astonishing piece this weekend in the Sunday Times. I don't know if you saw that. It was talking about the virus in Wuhan province and the origin, and there was some slight overtones of Chinese media suppression of what's really going on, et cetera. I thought it was somewhat sensationalistic, and it's somewhat emblematic of the times that we're living in terms of the politicization of the relationship between the West on the one hand and China on the other hand. And as you were talking, I was thinking about this in terms of Donald Trump, the president. You were talking about the weaponization of the U.S. dollar in certain through the banking system, et cetera. Now, Donald Trump's on his back foot domestically, but were he to understand that he only has a few months left until he's out of office, that could mean that he might need to accelerate his movements against China. Do you think that that is a potential threat? Those activities that you were talking about, weaponizing the dollar and the banking system, potentially as a political sort of salvo of at the end of a Donald Trump presidency.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things about this. I mean, the first is particularly following, John Bolton's revelations in his book. I don't really know what to think about. Maybe we just don't know what to think that President Trump might do next anyway. And whether he, basically has a secret admiration for Xi Jinping, or whether, current political circumstances demand that he kind of ups the ante. I think it's quite difficult to predict. I think though, having said that, that whatever happens probably after November, the basic thrust of American policy towards China probably not going to change very much. Maybe stylistically it'll change. Maybe it could change if the presidency changed. Maybe the approach to allies would be different. But I think the threat of weaponizing capital, I think, is probably going to remain. I mean, whether it actually comes to that or not is hard to say, because if you just wanted to reason this, from the point of view of logic and in whose interests would it be, to impose kind of Magnitsky type of sanctions against Chinese individuals or Chinese banks. I mean, it's different when you do it with, if it was ever, an issue, I can remember in the old Soviet Union, and certainly with Russia today, it's not an issue because Russia is simply just not, a big enough economic power and doesn't really matter that much, relatively speaking. But China is. And so the question is, who would be the winner and who would be the loser? I mean, probably everybody would lose, because if you started to sanction banks in Hong Kong, for example, given or restrict their access to US dollars, or for exchanging US dollars for Hong Kong dollars or what have you. I don't think that could be restricted to just Chinese institutions. I think it would have dynamic financial market consequences in which American banks and other foreign banks would become drawn in as well. So it's difficult to tell how, where would that end? And, does anybody really want to? It's the sort of the nuclear button in finance, isn't it, to do that? So is it something that has appeal from a political point of view? Absolutely, because that would really make that would hurt China in a way in which a few tariffs, can be basically brushed off as being, political pique, but really nothing that's really going to sort of destabilize the Chinese economy. But finance or restricting access to US dollars would have a dramatic effect.
And how much of that do you think this whole concept of potentially hurting China is based upon human rights in areas like the Uyghurs and Hong Kong, and how much of it is a competitive situation where the United States has now become it's become obvious that China is a player on the global stage, and the U.S. is worried?
Yeah, well, these two things have become, I think, not necessarily constructively conflated, right? So the idea about linking sanctions against China, or penalties to human rights and or to the national security law in Hong Kong. Of course, and Congress has basically, stepped up to take the lead in terms of legislating in both cases, subject to reviews and presidential approval and so on. I think, we should look at that, in one kind of corner, as it were, in the blue corner on its own. I don't think that it's a good idea. I mean, my view is that it's not a good idea for the United States or anybody else to basically look at sanctions in, from the same point of view, from a commercial point of view, because we might not like the idea that Huawei is a world leader in, 5G telecommunications infrastructure. We should basically redouble our efforts to make sure we're good at that too, if not better, rather than use sanctions, because I think that would be, it's not a good message for us, internally, let alone externally, and actually doesn't improve our relative standing or our comparative advantage. So I think we have to do both. I think we have to be very conscious of things that we think are important, from our point of view of values, standards, beliefs, governance criteria, and so on, and act accordingly. And I think where we feel that unfair advantage is being exploited by Chinese companies, I think we have a right to combat that in some way, or certainly to demand reciprocity with China. So if you do this, we'll do this, and so on. But actually, none of that should obfuscate from serious attempts that we must make, I think, to bring our technology and educational systems and economic systems, up to scratch, and to be able to make sure that we can perform top of our ability.
Well, the latest that I heard in terms of the Huawei fiasco, if you will, is the UK is looking to strip Huawei out of UK networks by the end of the year. I think this is what I'm understanding with regard to the UK government's plans going forward. What's the latest in the UK about Huawei? How much of it is a Five Eyes driven policy? How much of it is a US driven policy?
Well, whilst it was just a US driven policy, the British government under Prime Minister Boris Johnson, they actually took a decision to basically open up the telecommunications or the 5G rollout to, at least in part, to Huawei. They imposed a kind of a cap on it. I don't really get the kind of the technical bits of this greatly, but it was limited involvement, is the way they put it, up to about a third, and then other companies the rest, and so on. But this is a more recent shift. We are expecting a decision on this quite soon. And today, in fact, one of the former heads of MI6, intelligence agency, Sir John Sawyers, basically wrote a kind of an opinion piece in the Financial Times, essentially anticipating this reversal of policy and arguing why it's justified. He previously, having been a supporter of the government's policy. But so, to be honest, we can argue now about whether the intelligence community in the United Kingdom was, or leading members of it were right or wrong to basically think that so much has changed in China in the last 6 months. My view is nothing much has changed. It might have gotten worse, but we knew what it was like before. But be that as it may, there clearly is a shift going on, which I think is a product really of not specifically. I'm sure that behind the scenes, US officials have been badgering their UK counterparts to, toe the line, et cetera, et cetera. But I think what's really happened is a kind of a deeper appreciation on the part of the British government and by its own lawmakers in the British Parliament, who are almost, by a large majority in favor of a tougher line on China now. But it's been conditioned really by the whole pandemic experience, WHO experience, Hong Kong. So yeah, it's a big shift of view in the United Kingdom.
Right. And so it does seem like when you talk about the conflation between human rights, Hong Kong, and commercial interests, this is definitely coming into play. The pandemic has accelerated sort of an anti-China thinking in the US, UK, but also Five Eyes. So I would say Canada, New Zealand, Australia. My question is, especially when the only competitors to Huawei that I understand are in Scandinavia, what happens to the rest of the world that's aligned with the United States, like Germany, Finland, Nokia and Ericsson are the two companies in particular who are Huawei's competitors in 5G. Do you see the EU moving in the same direction, or is this something that is specific to the Anglo-American world?
No, it's slightly more complicated in the EU, but again, there has been, the ground is shifting slowly. So, earlier this year, actually, it was last year. Actually, I think the EU radically. I mean, they did like a 180-degree shift from because there's an EU-China dialogue which takes place. It's not quite at the level that the US-China dialogue used to be, but it nevertheless, it happens. And, in 2018, they still talked about China as a strategic partner. Since last year, certainly they talk about China as a systemic rival. The new president of the EU Commission and other officials of the EU Commission, plus leading officials in Germany and in France in particular, have voiced great skepticism within the last 2 or 3 months about China's involvement in local technology companies, in not playing by the rules, in making a mockery of the kind of the prevailing legislation or agreements governing Hong Kong and so on. So it's harder, of course, in the EU because you have to get 27 countries kind of lined up behind a policy. But if the French and the Germans and the Brussels administration basically have kind of bitten the bullet on this, which it looks to be that it is moving that way. I mean, Germany is still, I think, somewhat ambivalent because there's a big corporate lobby there. There is change going on, I think. So I would think that, I mean, I don't know whether this is going to happen or not, but my view would be that if you had a US administration after November, which was, shall we say, more collegiate and inclusive as regarding allies and alliances, I think it would do a lot to turn EU members to tilt them in the way that they seem to be shifting already.
Right. Interesting. Yeah. And as you were saying, that one thing that occurred to me is when you think about Germany in particular, you think about Germany's turn toward China in terms of an demand-driven type of system after the European debt crisis.